everyone. My name is Christian Marx. I have a couple of affiliations. I'm currently at Harvard Forest, and I'm also an adjunct professor at UMass Amherst. I'm a plant ecologist, and for quite a few years, I worked at the Nature Conservancy's Connecticut River program, which brings the connection to this symposium, which is we were working on floodplain forests, trying to both understand the ecology of the remaining forests that there are. Most of the floodplain forests in the watershed have been cleared and destroyed, but there are a few left, and so we wanted to study those to gain insights that we could apply in the other side of our work, which is to do restoration and try to bring back some of those sites. Initially we were looking at things like flooding thresholds, how that different species needed to thrive, whether they be native species or invasive species. And then that led into work about recruitment niches and succession, and most of that work has been published now, including a recent paper in December of last year on floodplain forest succession. And one thing that I wanted to highlight from all of that work that's perhaps relevant is the floodplain forest succession is initiated by the river channel migrating and creating new land in the form of bars. And so the native species are really adapted for seed dispersal to get to those sites first, and they require that exposed sediment to germinate. They can't compete in existing vegetation like you might have in an old hayfield. And so to promote natural recruitment, in an old hayfield, you first have to get rid of all that grass to create a natural seedbed, or a seedbed that resembles a sandbar. And the other aspect of it is these species disperse their seed early in the spring to early summer, depending on the species, so that it coincides when the floodwaters recede. And then they can fall on that new seed beds while they're still moist. The timing is very different than upland species. And of course, most non-native species also disperse their seed in the fall like upland species. So depending on when you make that seed bed available, you can have more or less favoring of recruitment of native floodplain species versus upland and invasive species. So that's all I'll say for now.
Great, thank you, Christian. That's great, and some of the research that you've been doing has really helped advise all of us that are working in this field, including Jess Torro, who is our next panelist. Make sure you introduce yourself, and we'll go from there. Thanks, Jess.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Jess Torro. I am co-owner of Native Habitat Restoration. I am currently, we work in a 4-state area, but I'm going to highlight 2 projects that are specific to the Housatonic River watershed. So the first site is in, oh shoot, sorry. Can you guys see my presentation?
We can see your slide. It says floodplain forest restoration.
Yeah, all right. Okay, there we go. It's unfrozen now. So the first site I'm going to talk about is a floodplain forest site in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. This is along the Housatonic River. It's a very popular walking site because it's handicap accessible. And initially, we did not actually consider replanting this area. It was strictly dealing with invasive plant control. And very quickly, we recognized after doing 3 years of invasive plant control that there was no tree regeneration occurring on the site. We could have assumed it, but the density, the heavy density of invasive species at this site was so great that you had hope that there was some floodplain tree species regenerating, but they really, it was not occurring at this site. So our planting design for the site was 1 acre. It occurred in an area where we were having a lot of erosion issues already. And we were concerned without some planting that we would lose much of the bank in this area. So the design was really to mimic regeneration. So we used a reference site, a couple reference sites close to this for our species list. And then we ran the species list through a climate filter, which was, I believe Tony's going to talk more about. Our second project is in South Lee, which again, Lee, Massachusetts, the Houstonic River. This is probably about 5 miles upstream of the Mary Flynn Trail. And this is it's owned, 2 properties owned both by Berkshire Natural Resource Council and Boyd Technologies. So local land trust that works throughout Berkshire County and a commercial entity. And here our design was a little more sophisticated. We did 3 years of invasive plant control, knowing we would be replanting in the 2 areas highlighted in green. But here we were able to incorporate some other aspects other than just climate change, the climate change filter with species. We looked at hyperaccumulating species to be able to do phytoremediation of organic pollutants that could have been potentially coming off of the commercial side, specifically the parking lot. We also looked at incorporating hub species and using Doug Talamay's lists of species that provide kind of greater abundance of insects. And we also looked at incorporating nut-bearing trees, since there is throughout this kind of maybe 3-mile portion of the river, very few existing nut-bearing trees anymore. I'm going to just also quickly talk, I was asked to talk about maintenance when it comes to these projects. I think it's much more fun to talk about the design side of things, but here, one of the things to consider with climate change is we rarely had winter flooding at the Mary Flynn Trail site. And due to a bunch of very high quantity liquid precipitation events, we had flooding. And so properly staking your trees and making sure any deer protection exists even in water and ice is important. Otherwise, you're going to be out there chipping away at ice to protect your trees, because rabbits can get right over them. The other thing in the face of climate change is to think about drought conditions in the summertime. Can you water your planting areas? If you start to have lack of precipitation over a 10-day period, you have to start thinking about how you're going to get into a site and water, and how much water you're going to be able to tank in. And then also, besides deer or beaver protection, also thinking about weed suppression, and not so much just the invasive control that needs to happen before you put your plants in, but actually, especially when you're talking about field conditions or field grasses, that kind of continued suppression around your planted trees. So with that, I pause.
Awesome, Jess. Thanks so much. And this is part of what is really exciting me about this panel, is we have such amazing experience with doing the restoration, that we have some deep knowledge of kind of these logistics. And I hope we get some good questions during the Q&A section on some of these fine-tailed details. Tom, if you want to turn on your camera and take it over.
There we go. Trying to get things set. Anyhow, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Lautzenheiser. I'm a senior conservation ecologist with Mass Audubon, and I've been involved with a few different floodplain restoration projects, but the one that I want to focus on today is a recent work that we've done at the Arcadia Wildlife Sanctuary in Northampton. And this was a great partnership between Mass Audubon, the City of Northampton, the Division of Ecological Restoration, and importantly, kind of a kernel for the idea, and a lot of technical help by Christian Marks at the Nature Conservancy, or then at the Nature Conservancy. So along the lines of what Jess was saying, I wanted to dig in a little bit about our thinking around project design here, particularly around plant species selection. Using some of the information from the Forest Service Climate Change Tree Atlas and so forth, we decided we wanted to do a bit of a assisted migration, have an assisted migration component to this project. So rather than simply kind of replicating the existing floodplain adjacent to our project site at Arcadia, we brought in a number of species that occur in lower numbers or don't occur yet on the property. The adjacent existing floodplain is dominated by species like silver maple, pin oak, and green ash. We immediately ruled out planting ash of any type because we have emerald ash borer on the property already. So that was a very important tree that we felt couldn't use. But instead, we decided to bump up the numbers of species that were on the northern end of the range that included things like swamp white oak and sycamore. And we also included a lot of black gums, and we also introduced sweet gum to the area, which was a bit of a leap for that plant. I think the northernmost native populations of sweet gum are in southern Connecticut. We also had specced out swamp cottonwood, but swamp cottonwood was not available in the nursery stock that we looked at, so we didn't use that. So after we made this investment in all of these plants, another important design consideration was protection against herbivory. We have, you can even see in this photo, there's a beaver lodge in one of the wetland areas there. There's beaver lodges adjacent to the project on both sides of this photo. We figured that basically anything we put out there would be quickly susceptible to either deer herbivory or beaver herbivory. So we decided to make the investment in substantial area deer, herbivory management that included 2 or 3 areas of electric fencing, and everything that's outside of the electric fencing is caged in individual tree cages. That approximately doubled the cost per plant for this work, and we planted over 3,000 trees and shrubs on the site, 14-acre site. But in my feeling, if a plant is $10 and a cage is $10, it's just as well to protect the plant rather than have to go back and replace it with another $10 plant, 2 years later after it's just gotten eaten. So giving those plants a chance to establish and grow for a few years before we remove those herbivory cages, I think was a good decision for us. So we had other design considerations, but leave it to the Q&A for now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tom. I love that picture and could almost see my house in the background. So that was exciting. Karen, would you like to turn your camera on and introduce yourself?
Okay, let me just get this. Okay, here we go.
Looks
Okay.
great.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Great to be here with everybody today. And I'm the Director of Stewardship for the Nature Conservancy in Massachusetts, overseeing, a team of folks that manage all of our lands in the state. And I'm going to talk about a project that the Nature Conservancy did at Fanny Stebbins Wildlife Refuge, which is the largest remaining floodplain forest on the Connecticut River. And Christian and I kind of tag team this project where he worked on the management plan and the design, and I came in and actually managed the implementation of the project. It's actually, the project started with a unique, land protection story to start, because this land was actually originally protected by the Allen Burn Club in 1951, and they were looking for a new owner for it. So TNC and the Conti Refuge kind of worked together, and we protected. Conti Refuge owns some land, but we've also, the Nature Conservancy right now owns about 244 acres at the site that will eventually transfer to Conti. As a way to fund the project, NRCS funded it, so the site has a wetlands reserve easement, and it also that provided some money for the restoration project. So that whole part took 5 years before we even started the restoration project. And then there was a team of folks, actually along with Christian, who designed the plan for it, including U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NRCS and Fanny Stebbins. There's a Friends of Fanny Stebbins group as well. So the project itself, the restoration project, started in 2018, and this slide kind of summarizes the work that we did, which included reforesting 7 old hay fields, and this included starting with tilling before we did planting of nearly 8,000 trees, shrubs, and ferns. And this site also included not over 90 disease-resistant elms from another project that Christian was overseeing in terms of restoration of American elm in the Connecticut River watershed and other areas in New England. And so also in terms of, had a large invasive species component. Both we had to control invasives around the fields to keep the invasives from seeding in once we tilled the fields, which we tilled them to enhance natural recruitment as well from the surrounding remaining floodplain forest on the site, which actually is quite substantial, particularly close to the river. But we also controlled 33 acres of invasive plants in the forest as well. And then there was a hydrologic component you can see in the bottom left, where we removed some old roadbed that was blocking sort of north-south flow. So the project is now maintained. The project finished in 2019, the actual implementation of the restoration. But and then the Conti Refuge is actually managing the property under an agreement with the Nature Conservancy, and it eventually again will transfer to them fully. Given the number of trees that went, and shrubs and ferns that went in, it was challenging to do protection. So we did put some electric fencing around some of these fields, and that has turned out to be, you sort of you can either protect each individual plant, or you can put electric fencing around each field, but there's still maintenance involved. Maybe with the fence around each tree, you can come in once a year, but the electric fence needs constant maintenance for falling trees and being shorted out by growing weeds and things. So that has been an ongoing challenge. And the initial grants did not, obviously include money for that. So I think I'll stop there. I just want to say I do have a report on the project if anyone wants to contact me for that report.
Thank you, Karen. Maybe you could put a link to that report in the chat box.
I don't have it online, so.
Okay. Great. Thank you. And our last panelist to speak is going to be Tony D'Amato. And then we'll get into some questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Hi, everybody. I'm Tony D'Amato. I'm the director of the forestry program here up at the University of Vermont, and also fortunate to be a part of the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center Consortium. And a lot of the work that really brought me into floodplain restoration and also floodplain resilience really was driven by an invasive species issue. And so the photo that all of you are looking at is not from the Northeast region. This is actually headwaters of the Mississippi River in Wisconsin. And those that can discern species composition can see there's quite a bit of ash in this forest, as well as Phragmites and reed canary grass and other challenges in the understory. And so a lot of the work that we've been doing and what's been motivating a lot of the work that we do from a research standpoint, as well as a partnership standpoint with managers, really focuses around the threat that emerald ash borer poses to riparian systems and headwater systems that are dominated by both green ash as well as black ash, depending on where you are in the Northeast. And so the work we've largely been focused on are trying to find ways to both restore tree cover to these areas that have been impacted, but also sustain tree cover in areas that haven't been impacted yet, but clearly will be strongly altered once the ash component has died. And so this project here is operational scale. So we're looking at a 270-acre area where over 100,000 seedlings were underplanted beneath an existing canopy of grain ash, as well as hackberry and other species. And has been brought up, we're not just thinking about the impact of emerald ash borer, but also these are areas that are being impacted already by climate change. And so the species that we select for these projects aren't just based on what ecologically is currently present on the site and some of the functions that we're trying to maintain through those species, but also using tools like the Climate Change Tree Atlas and other decision support tools that this gives some insight as to what might be the future adaptability for different tree species in these areas. And so planting some species that might be an example of assisted range expansion, with the hope being that not only would they be adapted to the future stressor of emerald ash borer, but also be able to deal with future climate regimes. And so we have the luxury from a science standpoint. I always joke that part of my job is to kill a lot of seedlings to show what is or is not possible, but there's certainly a little bit more flexibility and opportunity for us to experiment with different tree species, experiment with different approaches like mounding, and that might be a bit more intensive from a cost perspective, with the goal really being to do this in operational context. And so, as I mentioned, much of the work that we've done in floodplain restoration and resilience has been focused in the Lake States region, but we're now working both in the Champlain Basin, St. Lawrence Basin, as well as part of the Upper Connecticut River Basin. We're again looking at finding ways to either restore tree species, including important iconic species like the American elm that the Nature Conservancy has done a lot of work with, as well as trying to find ways to search for suitable replacements. And the last comment on this is that beyond looking at it from a ecological and a functional perspective, we also are in some cases looking at it from a cultural perspective, in that the loss of black ash in particular from these wetland systems certainly has immeasurable impacts on the cultural lifeways and traditions of indigenous people throughout the range of that species. And so some of the species we're planting, like Manchurian ash, box elder, have potential for alternative materials for basket making. So thinking about those as ways to both sustain kind of the ecosystem, but also those cultural lifeways. And so we have killed a lot of seedlings and learned a lot. And I think, as we get into discussions later today, just given the scale of some of the plantings that we were talking about, both from a research and also restoration standpoint, there's a lot of challenges that I think the whole group has identified in terms of how do we actually sustain and have the capacity to do this at large scales across the Northeast. So I'll stop with that because it seems like we're getting some questions coming in, and I turn over to Julie.
Great, thank you so much, Tony. And if all the panelists would like to turn their video on, then we'll jump into some questions. We have a couple coming in the Q&A box, but I am going to take the moderator privilege and start with one or two myself. In thinking about restoring these really important habitats, there's a lot that goes into them. We've heard that from each of you. How do we factor in invasive species? We've heard about this a little bit. As far as when are there too many invasive species to tackle? How do we choose a site? And what kind of site preparation do we need to do before even thinking about putting a tree in the ground?
Well, I guess I'll start, since both of our sites, plus the one that we worked with Julie, did require quite a bit of invasive plant control. We had to give a minimum of 3 years of invasive plant control. Really, most of the areas that we work in along the Housatonic River, but also in Eastern New York, are heavily invaded, very fragmented areas. So there, I think prior to any kind of planting, you have to consider what your invasives are. We have been fortunate not to have dealt with, not have large reed canary grass infestations, but more woody infestations in the sites that we've selected. I know at Bartholomew's Cobble, where Julie works, they had a certain strategy within reed canary grass. So I think when you're talking about herbaceous species, it would be, some of them we just have accepted to be on site and to not manage. We do also look at upstream issues, because knotweed moved extensively in the last couple of hurricanes, kind of extensively spreading it in a way that we just hadn't had prior infestations along. So we do look at upstream knotweed issues as well.
So as I mentioned, this site had, a large component of invasive species control. I like to say Fanny Stebbins has about every invasive species. It's a major corridor coming up through Massachusetts. It's got a rail line going through it. It's got Route 91. It's got the river next to it. It's got a lot of local public use. It's a favored area, and it's right across the river from Six Flags. It's near urban, so it will continue to have high pressure and be a site where you really need to do early detection and rapid response for new ones, but then really prioritize which ones you're taking care of. And for this project, the woodies got a lot of attention around the fields and in the forest. We did not deal with, garlic mustard is everywhere. There's goutweed. There was focus on stilt grass because was an early detection species. But certainly that work needs to be ongoing by the Conti Refuge, and hopefully they will be able to keep it at a manageable level. There's no way they'll be able to remove all invasive species at the site, but it would be great not to have new ones. And then I think, I mentioned the site preparation. That was important for not having immediately tons of invasive seeding into places where we're planting the trees.
Thank you both. I think it's so important when we're looking at these projects to really think about all the steps that lead into them. And as Jess and Karen and others have mentioned, it's often years of preparation, site preparation, before we can even get to the planting. How does climate change factor into these restoration projects? How are you looking at them? We heard a little bit from Tom and Tony about species selection. Are there other factors to think about?
Yeah, I guess just to maybe follow up on, a lot of how we selected species again, and it was similar with others, primarily looking at other locally adapted species that would make sense, trying to sustain or restore that function. And then we use some of the tools that exist, like the tree atlas, to see, are there other species that are also, floodplain species that aren't currently present in the system that might make sense to put in the site. And so for us, swamp white oak, sycamore, depending on where we are in the region, have been, even cottonwood have been important species. And then I think on just the planting perspective, in the last 5 years, if you were to plant during what is the normal planting window, you're likely going to be cooking seedlings, just given how hot it has been and dry in the spring. And so we've really shifted. And again, we're talking for our projects often, it's 5,000 to 6,000 seedlings. So it's not like it's hundreds of thousands, but we still are getting large orders, and we're trying to get them as early as possible now, and keep them in cold storage, just so that we can take advantage of either a really early summer, or try to keep them safe while it's like August outside and May. So I think we've even adapted a little bit on our planning side with when we order material, if we can, to get it as early as possible, and to try to keep it dormant as long as we can if need be. So that's just been a unexpected shift, even in, I guess, how we approach planting as it relates to climate change.
One aspect we looked into, and I have to give my business partner props because she really did the investigation on this, is we ended up going with, in one reforestation project, the deer tubes that are the kind of opaque plastic, because it actually maintained moisture better for the seedlings, and could it didn't really reduce the temperature, but it reduced the heat stress on bare root seedlings or saplings that we were putting in. So that was one consideration, knowing that watering may not be enough, is those deer tubes. But as Tom mentioned, they double your price of putting in something, if not more than that, per tree. So we did go with the opaque plastic and the netting on top, which is very important. And then we're also looking at surrounding them in high beaver potential areas.
I wanted to add a couple of things on the invasive species within New England have some climatic limits as well. So something like Asiatic bittersweet is very intense at riparian sites in southern New England, but in northern New England, it's much less intense. And that goes for a lot of the invasive species. There's really a north-south gradient. And I think it's probably just population density of people, but partly I think it's also climate, and they're moving gradually northward. And so a little bit following up actually on the previous question, the site preparation, it's important to remove kind of the species that will inhibit recruitment, but there are also the species that might be a problem later on. And the vines are a particular example of that, like the bittersweet, where in the earlier session, there was, these full red pine plantations that were now completely infested with bittersweet. And I've seen that on floodplain sites as well. They had initially good natural recruitment. Saplings are growing quickly, and then 10 years later, when they're starting to be trees, they're getting overwhelmed by these vines. So that is another area where kind of long-term management is really important, and where climate affects what that management has to be. And then the other piece that I wanted to mention is, of course, the most important process in a floodplain is flooding, and that flood regime can change with climate change, as well as with development in the watershed, or how large dam owners operate their dams. And so, for example, if we look at rivers on the East Coast from kind of on a latitudinal gradient, the flood peak is different. So like obviously in high elevations and further north, the flood peak is later in the spring, because that's when the snow melts there. And further south, it's mostly rain in the winter when there's no evapotranspiration. And so the flood peak can be in like December, January, February. And then further north, it can be as late as May. And associated with that is you have species that time their dispersal. So like species like sycamore, which is more southern, disperses its seeds in the winter. And, it falls on the snow and then gets moved with that earlier flood peak. And a more northern species like silver maple will disperse its seeds in early summer. And so it's kind of to coincide with that flood peak. So as you shift flood peaks, you shift composition in the floodplain forest. And so climate change will do that, but dam operations can also exacerbate that or mitigate that. So there's a lot of ways that the composition can change indirectly with climate change.
Thank you, Christian. So we have a question in from Nancy Olmsted saying a major challenge with floodplain forest management with respect to invasive species and climate change is the complex land ownership upstream and within the watershed. As we all know, some invasive plants can travel via water, and large flood events may be more common with climate change. So large investments in treatment may not work over a long time without a watershed scale approach. Does anyone have examples of working across organizations at a watershed scale to address these issues?
I was going to say I haven't done this myself, but I mean there was the Trappa control project, right? That Conti led over a large number of sites in the Connecticut River watershed. So that was an example, and then it's now I think more farmed out to various organizations since Cynthia Bettner retired. It's a kind of an example of a watershed approach.
I would hold up the Westfield Invasive Species Partnership as an example, which Karen, you helped found and many of us continue to perpetuate. We've recently done in partnership with DCR, substantial treatments along the east branch of the Westfield River, mainly to manage knotweed as a primary focus, and a number of other shrubby invasives as well. But I think that it's fair to say that that's been at a scale that would reach a watershed scale, I think. So yeah, I think there are some examples.
And Jess, you had mentioned you're looking upstream at knotweed and factoring that into your planning process.
Yes, actually, we've kind of bumped into it two different ways. Sometimes we've selected our sites because there isn't immediately large infestations of knotweed or other invasives upstream for a certain distance. We've also gone the other way, and with towns starting to ban herbicide use, we've explicitly not worked in areas downstream of those towns, because if the knotweed isn't going to get controlled for 11 miles and just get worse, why would we immediately south of that town start to try to do restoration, knowing the propagule pressure from upstream? So it has kind of pluses and minuses in terms of where you select your site. I do wonder how some of these towns with herbicide bans are not just going to get the entirety of the riparian systems, infested with knotweed or other invasives. So, you do know your locality, and if you have some of those problems in your watersheds, be careful of being downstream of them and investing in it.
And a little bit of a follow-up question that came in from Eli. What needs to be considered in floodplain forest restoration in the face of jumping worm invasion? Anyone want to take that on?
I could tell you guys a little bit, which is we have a site in Eastern New York full of jumping worm, and we're replanting it, and we're accepting that the jumping worm is there. We're not doing anything to control the jumping worm, but I do actually think that our planting design is a little more dense because of trying to get more soil stabilization.
Christian, do you have any thoughts on that? In my experience, looking at the floodplain forest at Bartholomew's Cobble, with the consistent sedimentation of kind of the natural flooding regime, it doesn't seem like there's the duff layer built up like it is in other natural communities. So I wonder if that's going to impact the jumping worms having an impact.
Yeah, so I've never studied jumping worms. I can't say much about that specifically, but I can comment on the leaf litter layer. That is, so important in the upland forests around here. In the floodplain, the annual freshet on the Connecticut River, a lot of floodplains, there can be like 2 inches of sediment coming in every year. So that leaf litter keeps getting buried, and it's almost like you can date the sediments based on those layers of leaf litter going back a few years until they decay. So there's a lot of carbon burial there, but it doesn't have that leaf litter that we associate with, say, a sugar maple bush or beech forest.
Thank you. So there's a question about some of our deer herbivory control and mentioning of electric fences. And do you have any do's and don'ts for using electric fence in floodplains?
Ooh, I'll take that one. Don't leave electric fence maintenance to your interns is probably unfortunately the answer to that. The electric fences, as Karen was alluding to, just need a lot of maintenance. But when properly maintained, I think they're really very effective. Following Christian's recommendation, we installed something called a 3D electric fence, 3 strands on the inside and 1 strand a few feet out. And the deer, we have actual game camera footage of this. The deer sort of assess the distance and then decide it maybe not worth it to jump over when the fence is working. An important component of that is baiting the fence. So every couple of weeks I run around and apply apple goop to these little scent stations on the fence, so that if a deer is drawn in, it gets zapped on its nose and learns that the fence is something to avoid, as opposed to just walking through it. So maintenance, I think, is the critical thing. And when you fall behind on maintenance, boy, the deer just get in there and wreak havoc. And I think, Rennie, you ask the question, we're out there measuring those elms, and there are some of them are not growing very much as they've all been eaten by deer. So you pay the price for not maintaining the fence as well as it needs to be. So that's probably the top line do, is just you got to stay on top of it.
Eli has a follow-up question asking about hunting as part of ongoing maintenance.
We do have hunting at one of our 2 sites that I highlighted, and I would say that they do not lower the deer population significantly enough. And unfortunately, because the way our two sites in South Lee works, where the hunting is, you know, it doesn't quite total 20 acres. You can't have high densities of hunters. So we have like, I think 3 on site, but it's just not enough.
I think the key is a depredation permit and really going above and beyond casual hunting access for deer management. Some of the herds, like at Arcadia, this time of year, you'll see 20 or 30 animals at once, and they just come through. And so to make a dent, it's going to take more than just opening the property to standard hunting seasons.
And also, like at Fanny Stebbins, we talked about it, but it's such an urban, you know, Long Meadow is right up against, and people walk there constantly. It'd be such a big community outreach. You really have to start years ahead with that and really convince the public. So it would be a big outreach component to do that.
And I think so tied to size of the project area and kind of context where you're in, because we've seen that where, you know, we've tried to have some of our properties open to hunting, but if we're surrounded by lands that aren't open to hunting, it's just a waste of time to put a lot of effort into getting those hunters out there. Another question for you all. Do you have any success stories of involving the community, local communities in these projects?
I'll take that too. I think for our project at Arcadia, over 2 years, we involved each year between 60 and 80 volunteers to help us plant the over 3,000 plants that we put in. And without that community effort, the project costs just would have made the project infeasible. So I think that the community involvement really made that successful. And frankly, both of the 2020 and 2021 planting events were the highlight of my year, just to get everybody out there. You know, we were able to maintain social distancing and so forth in this pandemic, and just getting to do this, you know, really forward thinking work to plant trees. Who doesn't love planting trees and taking care of trees? So just mobilizing that goodwill and energy to get this good work done was really just a phenomenal community activity. So I think it was just great, and I highly recommend that approach. Some quality control, I think, you know, issues with some of that, but we tried to you know, put the time and effort into helping people understand what they needed to do, and I'm very pleased with the results that we've gotten. It was an easy site though, very, you know, deep soils. We pre-dug all the holes. All people had to do was just drop the plants in and put some soil around them, get things like that. So, but yeah, highlight of my year.
We also use volunteers, and actually it comes from the commercial side of the project. They shut down their manufacturing operations for the day, and the whole, all of the staff at that site gets paid to come out and volunteer. And so they initially started helping with the invasive plant control, and now they're having their 4th community stewardship day, and we'll be planting trees. So it does, they take a tremendous amount of pride in their kind of landscape of the commercial side. And there's some hope that eventually there will be from that property a walking trail. And so I think all of this, your community involvement can get you additional results, positive results in terms of commitment to a future walking trail and other things.
Anyone else have community comments?
I can share a story. So I've done a lot of projects with partners on planting disease-resistant elms to try to get them back on the landscape. And one thing that Tom said definitely is being part of my experience is that people love planting trees. It's just so much more positive than killing invasives. And then the other piece of it is a lot of the volunteers tend to be from an older generation who had this nostalgic feeling for this huge elm tree next to the house where they grew up or on their way to school, or so they connected really a lot with this idea of restoring elms. And the other piece that Tom mentioned that I think is really important is the location. So you need kind of a convergence of factors where it tends to work really well near urban areas. So one example that maybe I'll mention is in Glastonbury, Connecticut, one of the Hartford suburbs. There was a volunteer group called Glastonbury Partners in Planting, who were trying to beautify the city and do these kinds of restoration projects. And so they had this very dynamic leader, an older lady named Betty Schmidt. And she saw me give a talk about elms and said, oh, we want to do this. And so we did a project there on where they had created a new Riverside Park. And it was perfect because it was right on the interface between this really urban park with like baseball diamonds and things like that that were highly maintained, and then this riparian area that was more wild, because it gave that easy access Tom was telling about, where it was easy for people to plant on the edge of the lawn. And then the city's arborists and parks group could easily maintain these trees. But at the same time now, 10 years later, those trees are too tall to measure with their measuring rod. Some of the Nature Conservancy staff still monitor those trees, and they're all producing seed now, which was really my personal goal, was not to create a lot of trees, but to create a lot of seed going into the natural habitat, so that these disease-resistant genes will spread into the riparian forest and into the river, and then the waters will spread them further. And yeah, so that's already happening at that site. And it's partly because of that convergence of kind of the urban, the city people, the NGO people, the volunteers, and just that location right on the periphery between kind of urban landscape and wildlife.
Thanks, Christian. So we have just a couple of minutes left, and we've hit a lot of topics so far. So I think I'll just throw out this one last question and see if there's anything else that we've missed, or if there's a particular point that you guys would like to highlight, and maybe give each of you a chance to have a final comment. What is kind of the most important factor to consider as you're looking at one of these restoration type of projects? I'm going to start while you guys are all thinking, because I can see you all thinking. For me, I originally started looking at our floodplain forest project. I did one down in the southern Berkshires, looking at it from the biodiversity angle. But it quickly became apparent that it has some real climate change significance to mitigating storm flow as we're getting these higher intensity rain events. And so for me, really trying to think about, okay, how can I do both? Because it's all increasing resiliency, but how can I look to adapt this local habitat to climate change by a management activity, such as planting trees and picking out which ones should go in there. Kind of probably the same for a lot of us, but does anybody else have a last comment or two? Karen?
I think that we did not spend enough time thinking about the long-term maintenance and management of the site. Like that should be built in from the beginning. And we underestimated the deer pressure. And unfortunately, it's very hard to find funding for that component, but consider the volunteer corps or something like that, to really, because it is a shame to put so much money into these restoration projects and then have the trees die. It's very discouraging. So I just encourage folks to do that.
I'm going to say, I think a really important factor is the site. We touched on this a little earlier about, maybe if you've got like an old field or something that's entirely bittersweet, then maybe that's not the place to work, because you're going to be having to fight against the bittersweet and the seed bank. Or maybe if on the other hand, if you've got the opportunity or resources to address that first, then maybe that becomes a great place to put in a forest. But I think you have to do that kind of assessment of what you're willing to bite off first, and that's really just based on the site characteristics. So,
Tony?
Yeah, and I was just going to kind of double down on what Karen said, in that I think a lot of these projects, there's tremendous excitement and involvement. In the early stages, we were talking about community partnerships, but we're trying to restore forests to very challenging sites, and that takes a long-term commitment to really both taking care of these areas, but also being able to adapt to some of the dynamics we discussed today in terms of both changes in flooding regimes, new invasive species. And so I think really these projects, the key element, and I think where some of them do fail, is after the first 5 years of enthusiasm and getting trees out there, that ability to maintain them over time and really achieve what the long-term goal is. And so finding mechanisms to sustain that, whether it be via partnerships or some unique funding models, is pretty critical.
Great. Well, looks like we're at time. So I want to thank all of you for participating in this panel discussion. I learned a lot, and I already knew all your projects, so this is exciting. There are still some questions in the Q&A box, so if you guys want to look at that while we move on to the next session. Thank you all.